will break away from your usual procedure in the hope that the next lecturer, or at any rate if ever I had the privilege to come to you during, would speak in the national language. To a very large extent, the pursuit of our business, private as well as governmental, through the medium of the English language is responsible for the sterility of our foreign policy. Some of you may have been surprised that I call this exceedingly successful foreign policy sterile. When everybody is full of praise of a performance, it is somewhat risky to doubt its value. But the truth must be told. Even if one has to place oneself in the minority of one, it is always necessary in the interest of future advancement to tell the truth. India seems to have acquired a high place in the Committee of Nations. We are told practically every day through our newspapers, which carry more of foreign news than of native news, which again is a positive proof of the failure of our foreign policy, because if our foreign policy had been successful, newspapers would have carried more national news than foreign news. These affairs have to be looked at in the light of what is the true situation. Have we really acquired a high place in the Committee of Nations, or is that only superficial? And even if we have acquired a high place, does that really mean the emergence of any new forces? Because that is the real test. The mere fact that we are a 350 million people, that we are an ancient people, that we are the land of Mahatma Gandhi, would have sufficed to give us a high place as soon as we got our freedom. Not every country has got 350 millions. Not every country is 5,000 years old and more. Not every country has the unique advantage of having had the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. These three factors would have sufficed to give this country an honorable place, no matter who the government had been. The most foolish and the most stupid of prime ministers would have given India an honorable place because of these three factors. Because these are massive weights which dare not be neglected. After all, when you hear of such phrases as the biggest in Asia, whenever I am shown a hospital building, I am told it's the biggest in Asia. Or a building of gymnastics or sports, oh, it's the biggest in Asia. And then of course everything else happens to be the biggest in Asia. There is inside that phrase a concealed fraud. What is Asia? Which Asia? Which nation? What population? comparing ourselves all the time with small countries like Afghanistan and Burma and Ceylon, with 20 or 30 million people, and giving ourselves the unique privilege of calling ourselves the biggest in Asia. After all, we are 350 million people. And furthermore, there are certain elementary facts about international life that must be known. For instance, when an Indian becomes the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, there is great deal of pleasure and excitement in our ranks that one of our nationals has acquired a high place. I too was very happy when one of our beautiful nationals became the President of the General Assembly of the League of Nations. She still is beautiful. But then, the importance of such a happening must be seen in its proper context. For all the year, you were continually told through your newspapers that India has acquired a high place. And the proof was that an Indian had become the President of the General Assembly of the League of Nations. Would it surprise you to learn that only a member belonging to the low caste, low that is in international affairs, because even in international life there are castes, same as there are castes in our internal life, Brahmins and Pandits. In international life, there is the caste of the big powers on the one hand and the small nations on the other. The five big powers, and now of course it's no longer 55, it's how many? 71. That is 5 Brahmins and 71 Shudras. That is the international situation. Now, would it surprise you to learn that nobody belonging to the 5 Brahmin nations is ever permitted to become the President of the General Assembly of the League of Nations? Only one belonging to the Shudras is allowed to become the President of the General Assembly of the League of Nations. That's a convention. But this fact is never told to you. Nor does the people of India ever care to inquire into such facts. And for one whole long year, the newspapers told us, and we believed it, and everybody was mighty happy. Oh, our national has become the President of the General Assembly of the League of Nations. Similarly, achievements must be examined, not alone in the light of their temporary effect, but their enduring value. It may well be possible that some of these great powers actually want certain things to happen, but they are far too great to voice those requirements themselves. And they find it profitable as well as amusing to have someone else do their speaking. So that, speaking more concretely, in the context of the world today, where we have America on the one hand and Russia on the other, with their separate powerful ideological and military drives, it may well be necessary for both these camps to make use of persons and countries who can act as agencies of adjustment, as brokers, as carrying messages to and fro. After all, does not a rich and a powerful person need the services of a messenger? Do not powerful nations sometimes need the services of brokers? They are, of course, very high-placed brokers, and they are given a great deal of honor. But the point is to find out whether what India has been doing in the past 8 years of freedom has been in the nature of a real emergence of totally new forces in the world, or merely an adjustment among the forces that already existed before 8 years. That is the question. Whatever may be your answer, I do not want you to accept my answer, but ask the question of yourself. Are we creating any new forces in the world, or helping to create them, because we alone can't do so? There must be other nations that do so. Or are we merely playing between the already existing forces, going to and fro? And with this background, I may take up certain issues one by one, the more important issues that seem to be confronting mankind today. Before I pick them up one by one, let me point out that whatever crisis of foreign policy you find today in our affairs is nothing else but a reflection of the crisis of human civilization. It is no longer a crisis that used to be in the 19th century and thereafter, and in the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, where diplomatic exchanges could still be effective. European capitalism had at that time still certain possibilities of progress and advancement, though not, of course, for all the world. That again is a matter of thought for itself. That is for the white countries. And the rivalries among European powers at that time were not merely wars, but even stepping stones to further advancement, of course, of their own nations. At that time, crisis in foreign policy was of a totally different kind. For instance, I had my Professor Hermann Onken, one of the greatest historians of the time during which he lived, write a book, a very thin book of no more than 120 pages. Incidentally, some of us think that long books are very deep books, but that is not so. The deepest books of humanity are the shortest books. For instance, Patanjali or Panini, their own, no one has written greater books. They are short books. Anyway, Hermann Onken wrote a book of 120 pages on the title of the book was long, on the foreign policy of Great Britain over 120 years, that is of the 19th century and 20th, or the problem of the military security of India. Now that, of course, would be a very interesting subject, but I won't delay over it, and I was conclusively established to me that the main hinges of British foreign policy in the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th were indeed the problem of the military security of India. Now those were entirely different crises. Today, the crisis in foreign policy, the struggle between India and Pakistan, or China and Formosa, or America and Russia, or Israel and the Arab world or any other struggle is nothing else but a reflection of the crisis in human civilization. And what is that crisis? That humanity is no longer able to make any rational use of the economic, political and other arrangements that it finds in the world today. That it is split up into formidable camps of economic inequality. Actually, with the background knowledge of the world not being available to the Indian people, it becomes exceedingly difficult to confine oneself to the subject of foreign policy, because after all, foreign policy relates itself to the background of knowledge and information about the world and oneself. For instance, it's not known that America produces annually 110 million tons of steel, and Russia 50 millions, and India 1.5 millions. And only that is known, what's the use of talking about foreign policy? After all, one must know some facts. Against 110 millions of American steel, 50 millions of Russian steel, we have 1.5 million tons of steel. Of course, we have the unique advantage of being able to tell the peoples of the world in the name of Mahatma Gandhi to disarm, to disband their armies. Some saint asked them to disband the land army, and a little later some other saint asked them to disband the naval army. And of course our souls are mightily pleased. And all the while, the country with this 1.5 million tons of steel goes on amassing as much scrap as it can. All the refuse and the junk and the bulk that can come from Russia or America or anywhere in the shape of faulty little airplanes that go up in the sky that are little screeching, screaming jet planes and the like. This is the background information that one must possess in order to understand the total crisis of human civilization. I would, for instance, bring before you this fact that America and Russia, which have between themselves only 360 million people, that is, say, 36 crores of humanity, produce between themselves more than 60% of the world's food or industrial goods, agricultural and industrial production. Now there you are. Something like 1/6 of the world or 1/7 of the world. 1/7 of the world produces 2/3 of its goods. Imagine the phenomenal inequality in this, that 1/3 of the world should produce 2/3 of its, 1/7 of the world should produce 2/3 of its goods. What further crisis do you need? Because in the background of this unequal production, other facts follow. You are probably familiar with your status in international life. India, of all the, you said 76, of all the 76 member countries in the United Nations, India is the 76th country in respect of food. And that is not my fact. That is the fact registered by an inquiry of the United Nations organization, which counted up the number of calories eaten up by an average individual in every country. We eat up 1,500 calories of food every day, and every other country has an average higher than ours. So that of 76 countries, India is the 76th in respect of food. Because when you think of your high international status, please think also of your food status in the world. Of 76 countries, India is the 76th. And of the 50 countries and more that participated in the Olympic sports at Helsinki, because I would apply both tests, the test of bread as well well as circus. Bread and circus are the two most important tests of humanity. They have been so ever since the days of the Roman Empire. And these two are the chief objectives of all political action, no matter what government rules. Every government is interested in giving food to its people and in arranging such circuses. When I say circus, I mean everything, sport, entertainment, play, festive occasions, collecting people on the roads, getting gay crowds, making people throw flowers at all kinds of visitors, all circuses. Now, bread and circus. From the viewpoint of these two tests, bread and circus. In the matter of circus, I counted up the total number of marks obtained by India's sportsmen at Helsinki. We are the 32nd country. In respect of bread, we are the 76th country, that is the last in the United Nations. In respect of play and sport, we are the 32nd country. Now that is the crisis. And not only that, supposing we were to generalize this experience over the whole world, then most of Asia, all of Africa, practically all of South America are like us. Although, of course, they are slightly better than us. I mean, we are the absolute deep down rung of the ladder, but they belong more to us than they do to the white world. Now that is the crisis of human civilization. Furthermore, without going into any elaborate details, I suppose an analogy would make the whole thing more significant to you. It is somewhat like the Mahabharata war, where the Kauravas and the Pandavas fought each other so mercilessly that there was no giving of water. Utter desolation and annihilation. Even more than you find is the motive in the actions of the Russians and the Americans. After all, the Kauravas and Pandavas fought each other no less bitterly than the Russians and the Americans do. But then, just as Kauravas and Pandavas of an ancient age could say, and did say, the Pandavas particularly, we are 5 within ourselves, but against the outside world we are 105. Varam panchatikam shatam. They fought each other, they decimated each other, they destroyed each other, and yet against the outside world they were neither 5 nor 100, they were 105. Beyond going into elaborate explanations of this, permit me just to put forward this proposition that the Russians and the Americans, although they may annihilate each other, decimate each other, destroy each other, are actually one against the outside world. That is the crisis of humanity. Our civilization has acquired, when I say our, I mean the human civilization, because after all, the Indian civilization just at the moment is not worth considering overmuch. The human civilization has acquired, on the one hand, great activity resulting in strife as far as the white part is concerned, the European and the American, where activity has assumed such serious and grave forms as to degenerate into strife. And the other, this 2/3 of humanity, has acquired sloth, where an otherwise exceedingly commendable virtue, that is, poise, inward peace, has degenerated into sloth. So that is the crisis of human civilization, where one part of the world has allowed its activity to degenerate into strife, and the other is poised into sloth. Now, I would not give you any further the background, come on to the actual concrete manifestations of the crisis of foreign policy, where the simple truth that all men are equal. For the world can be one only when it is equal. Oneness means equality. Oneness can never arise out of inequality. This simple truth that all men are equal, not only within the national frontier, but also among the nations, has to be applied to international affairs. Let me straight away take the question of international organization. There is the United Nations, with its membership, its executive councils, its executive rights. What is the situation today? It does not include every nation. With very great difficulties, after nearly 7 years of blundering and delaying and tarrying and stupid bargaining and maneuvering, some 16 nations have been brought in. But mind you, 7 years of blundering. One of the worst tragedies of mankind is to be happy when a long-awaited thing comes. But if it comes after great delay, its news is no longer there. The United Nations have, right from the start of their inception, lacked in 3 great qualities. They have manifested 3 great defects. 1, they have been limited in their membership. That is, not all the nations have been included in them. 2, that they have given the right of veto to the big powers in respect of collective decisions. 3, that there are certain permanent seats on the Security Council, that is the Executive Council of the United Nations, reserved for these 5 great Brahmin nations. Lack of universality and the prevalence of the international caste system has definitely corrupted the United Nations organization right from the start. And therefore, I do not wish to talk of Indian socialism, because although it's very correct, it's somewhat weak, and therefore one shouldn't talk about weak although correct persons. After all, a very great and substantial part of truth is its strength. Truth without strength is no truth at all. But I hope, and I hope that some of you would also hope with me, that someday Indian socialism would be able to acquire a little strength so that its truthful policies may be put into effect. Indian socialism has all through been suggesting universal membership of the United Nations and abolition of the veto and of permanent seats on the Security Council. With these 3 changes introduced all at a time, for remember, in affairs international as well as national, you cannot split up a reform program, take up one item, give up another. If these 3 features had been introduced, the United Nations might have tended to become a repository of the conscience of mankind rather than a clearing house of international intrigues such as it is today. No international organization would ever be able to carry out its duties unless it commanded the loyalty and the allegiance of man, not national governments, not their heads, unless it could talk directly to the conscience of every single individual living in the world and impress upon him the words of its decisions. Ultimately, of course, any international organization that set out to command such allegiance would have to depend upon the adult vote. Just as in national affairs there is a parliament elected by the adult vote, which alone can command the loyalty of the people in a democracy. In a democracy, no Raj Pramukh or Raja can command loyalty, no oligarchy, no aristocracy, not even elites of leaders. They might, on certain occasions, when the conscience of man is eclipsed. But otherwise, in a democratic atmosphere, it's only a parliament elected by the adult vote that commands the allegiance of the people, even when its decisions go wrong. Because the hope is always there in the breast of every man that no matter this particular parliament has made a wrong decision, another will set it right. Is the adult vote. The adult vote, which is the expression of the sovereignty, the equality, and the oneness of individuals living within a nation. That same adult vote has to be transferred to the international sphere. And a parliament must be brought into being for all the world, which is elected by the adult vote. Of course, when I put forward this proposal in a company of, let us say, Europeans or Burmese, they think that I am being somewhat parochial, because India with 350 million would get a large number of seats in a world parliament. To that, my answer would be, have an upper house, a council of nations, with an equal number of representatives from each nation, where the question of adult vote does not arise, or have some kind of regional weightages, so that small nations with small populations may have some equality of representation. Anyway, start with this world parliament of adult vote. Now I have more or less told you all about the composition and the powers and characteristics of a suitable international organization. Because that question ties up both with the questions of collective security and disarmament. What is collective security? In abstraction, it appears to be a sound principle. Who would not like collective security? The peace of the world has to be secured. But by whom? Where? And in what manner? So much fraud exists in the world today on this question of collective security that nations, whole nations, vote on resolutions of aggression at a meeting of the United Nations. But when it comes actually to fighting the named aggressor, they give no troops. They are not even prepared to break their relations with the aggressor. Can there be greater fraud than this? The history of the United Nations over the past 7 or 8 years is strewn with such incidents of naming an aggressor insofar as a paper resolution is concerned and refusing to fight him insofar as actual action is concerned. And what is that due to? I'm not apportioning any blame. I'm merely wanting you to see the world as it exists today. It's a world of fraud in the realm of collective security. But why is that so? Obviously because the United Nations, which are an expression of this collective security, do not command the allegiance of mankind. They are limited in their membership. They give extraordinary rights to the 5 permanent nations, the veto and permanent seats. Their decisions are not above suspicion, and therefore collective security may be an estimable principle in abstraction, but in its concrete manifestations through an existing international organization, it just does not exist. This must be ended. If the world really wants to have peace and an organization that will secure collective security, then its decisions must be respected, and nations must learn to vote only when they are prepared to act, otherwise not. And they can do so only if an international organization of the kind that I described earlier comes into existence. The present United Nations is so much a clearing house of international intrigues, a battleground of passions and angers and traditional prejudices of the two warring clans, that mankind will not be prepared to repose its trust in that organization. And therefore, a question of collective security applying to that particular organization does not arise. Of course, I know there are a very large number of Asian thinkers, statesmen, politicians, writers, and leaders, and heaven alone knows what else. Although, of course, largely speaking, Asian political leaders are nothing else but a blind imitation, either of one camp or the other of the white masters. We are so much enslaved to white thought that we have not been able to strike out into new directions. Anyway, most of them talk of collective security as though it were a sacred principle. But then, I would once again repeat that collective security as an abstract ideal has absolutely no meaning unless its concrete manifestations in some actual international organization of the day are regarded and understood. Unless mankind were prepared, even under unwillingness, to accept the decisions of an international organization, collective security would not come into existence. Same as a nation accepts the decisions, sometimes unwillingly, of its own parliament, similarly the world must be willing to accept decisions of a United Nations organization, although unwillingly. Supposing a United Nations were today to decide in the Indo-Pakistan conflict coming nearer home, either in India's favor or in Pakistan's favor. Whichever way the decision went, whether against India or against Pakistan, the peoples of the two countries should be prepared to accept that decision, although they may fret against it and fume against it and talk against it and kick up a row about it. So far as free speech is concerned, you know very well that I would want to give free speech to everybody. Let them talk about it, but they should not go against it. And that can only happen if the entire complex of collective security as well as United Nations is properly understood. With that, I come to the question of disarmament. I don't know whether you are afraid of the atom bomb or the hydrogen bomb. I am. But I am also afraid of other bombs. Other simple and what are known as conventional bombs. Mankind has come to a crisis in which weapons are being called conventional and unconventional. Conventional weapons. They are the weapons sanctified by usage and tradition. But whose usage and whose tradition? Again the fights. Because these conventional weapons, if I were to give you an idea of what they are, can be just as disastrous as the atom or the hydrogen bomb. In Hamburg, on a certain day, for nearly 30 hours, the Allied forces of that time rained simple conventional bombs called the naphtha bombs, and over 30,000 persons died in a single day. 30,000 persons. And it was not a simple death. They don't die that easily. They burn in their skins. And the burning goes on for hours and hours. It may be 20 hours and more. And then their relations and their friends take them outside the town, and they dig up holes. They put their friends and relations into those holes, so that their bodies might at least be removed from the contact of air and might not burn. Of course, they can't intern them beyond the neck because these persons have to breathe. But then, the anguish of pain is so much that I have heard people tell me that they shot their own relations, brothers and husbands and wives, in order to put them out of pain. Those are conventional weapons. Whether conventional weapons or nuclear weapons, humanity has to get rid of both. And as far as we are concerned, we, the 2/3 of humanity, without either the nuclear weapons or the conventional weapons, for please remember that in spite of all that you are told every day in your newspaper, you cannot carry on a war for more than 20 days unless one or the other of the white powers gives you kerosene and petrol and bombs and airplanes and spare parts and repair parts and the like. Let this be definitely understood, that one or the other white power, either the Atlantic camp or the Soviet camp, must supply you petrol, airplanes, spare parts, tanks, even ammunition, before you can prosecute a war on its 21st day. For 20 days you may. Because you probably have, that is your government, has probably stored up enough material to be able to war for 20 days. So that India and Pakistan, who strut about like, peacocks of borrowed feathers, I was wrong in saying that. Pakistan probably not for more than 7 days. But anyway, this is the situation both in India and Pakistan. Now, so far as we are concerned, conventional weapons and nuclear weapons and all other weapons are like hooded serpents of an ancient fable, which every one of us, you and I, used to hear from our grandmothers, which were meant to guard underground treasure. Those stories, how these hooded serpents, numerous in number, guard treasure which is held underground. That story is very significant. These nuclear and conventional bombs are nothing but the hooded serpents of ancient fable to guard treasure. That treasure of America and Russia, of which I gave you an inkling, that 1/7 of humanity produces more than 2/3 of its goods. That is the treasure. It is far easier to guard that treasure through these serpents than to share it with those who are poor, same as nationally. What person would, among the rich, would distribute his riches in order to spare himself fright and possible ruin, rather than employ gunmen to secure his treasure? Gunmen will be there, and you find these gunmen strewn all over the place before bank buildings, all such other buildings and private buildings, they are there. Because it's much easier and more comfortable to have a series of gunmen than to distribute that treasures. Who would do it? I mean, it's just not done, Of course, I don't want to go into that question, but I told Mahatma Gandhi, and he was good enough and great enough to print it in his own hijack, that in spite of the fact that he strove for more than 30 years, he succeeded in producing only one trustee in his entire lifetime. And no man can be greater than Mahatma Gandhi on this matter of that answer. Only one trustee. It's just not done, Of course, I don't want to go into that question, but I told Mahatma Gandhi, and he was good enough and great enough to print it in his own hijack, that in spite of the fact that he strove for more than 30 years, he succeeded in producing only one trustee in his entire lifetime. And no man can be greater than Mahatma Gandhi on this matter. Of that answer, only one trustee, who I, on closer inspection, found was a complete capitalist in the sphere of production. Because Mr. Jamnalal Bajaj's factories were run in the same way as anybody else's factories. There was no distinction between that capitalist and any other capitalist. He was 100% capitalist in production, and I'm sure he was 100% trustee in the sphere of consumption, because his dress and food and all the rest of it was on a level with everybody else. And he was a 50% trustee and a 50% capitalist in the sphere of inheritance. I would advise you to examine every concept prevalent in India today a little more closely. This trusteeship concept has to be examined from these three angles of production, consumption, inheritance. And as I told you, on closer inspection of the sole trustee which that great man produced, in 30 years of labor, I found that sole trustee was 100% capitalist, 50% in production, 50% in inheritance, and 100% trustee in consumption. Anyway, in international affairs, it's even more difficult to discover trustees. What Americans and Russians would agree to become trustees for this depressed humanity where only 1,500 calories of food are eaten every day. They can only think in terms of foreign aid. And you know what that foreign aid is? Of course, newspapers are full of it. Foreign aid. National Extension Project aid, Ford Foundation aid, Russian aid, million-ton steel aid, this aid and that aid. The newspapers are full of these aids. It might appear as if the whole world is moved by the desire to do good. So much foreign aid. But in actual terms, do you know what that means? Contrasted with the incomes and expenditures of America and Russia, this foreign aid is absolutely nothing. I will not go into a detailed inquiry of this question of foreign aid. Suffice it for me to bring up one or two examples. For instance, right at the moment, southern Indochina is being given dollar aid amounting to, I may be mistaken in rough approximations one way or the other, but largely I am correct. Southern Indochina is being given dollar aid at the rate of 200 rupees per person annually. 200 rupees per person annually. Aid from outside. And ours, of course, those figures are all fraudulent, which the government of India produces. But even assuming them to be correct, ours is about 200 of national income every person. What is given to southern Indochina in the shape of foreign aid from outside is earned and spent by us nationally, all of it. That is governmental expenditure, private expenditure, and everything. And why is that aid being given to Indochina? Because Indochina is actually the theater of a war, and southern Indochina has ranged herself militarily, economically, and ideologically on the side of the Atlantic camp. It is possible that if Russia were to acquire similar riches, she hasn't today, but supposing she were to come up to American riches, not exactly equal them, but even approximate them, it is possible that Russia may also become equally generous with such countries as are definitely its allies. So that the question of foreign aid has to be looked at from two angles. One, that it is not at all liberally given. Another, even when it is liberally given, it is given only to one's military, economic, and ideological allies, and not to humanity, not to man. It is given to that man who is my friend. It is not given to that man who is not my friend. That is the position of foreign aid. And furthermore, the basic position is, of course, that foreign aid doesn't even scratch the problem. Again, I would have to bring up questions of national income and so on and so forth. In Russia and America, they have billions and, hundreds of billions of rupees as their national income. How they live and what they spend, it would be extremely surprising for you. If I were to give you examples of how they live and what they spend, you would be staggered. I mean, for instance, of course, the front row is rather comfortably placed. They have easy chairs, armchairs, but not very comfortably. In America, if I were addressing an audience, probably there would be contour furniture. And you know what contour furniture is? Contour, that is, you have a body, isn't it? With its shapes and curves. And the chair must also correspond to the shapes and curves of your body, which is contour furniture, so that you may be comfortable. It's perfectly all right. I've just given you an illustration of what those countries are. And you can apply that to steel and milk and eggs and fruit and bombs and hydrogen atom and everything else. Now, from such countries comes foreign aid. What aid? National Security Extension Project, Ford Foundation, that aid which only corrupts a people, which never builds up, which only spreads the cover of some kind of thing happening, and underneath everything goes on, which only helps native waste and corruption and employment of people in government services, not with a view to build, but with a view to appease, to maintain the ruling party in power. Foreign aid is given not with a view to build humanity, but with a view to maintain certain segments of the native population in power in correspondence with the requirements of one or the other foreign capital. If I had my way, I would want the Indian people to declare that this foreign aid must stop, that this only makes a pretense at being liberal and generous and at being a forerunner to a new humanity, that this foreign aid only helps to keep in power a corrupt native bureaucracy, and that if ever international assistance were to come, it should come in the shape of an international capital authority to which every nation contributed according to its capacity and from which every nation drew according to its requirements. A world development authority. And that could be easily done. If we had no other tests, we could apply the test of the volume of war budgets. That is, corresponding to their war budgets, nations may be expected to correspond a 10% or contribute a 10% or a 20% of their war budget to such a world development authority. So that disarmament links up with the question of collective security and of making the world one and equal. Supposing America and Russia have 100 billion rupees of war budget, they spend that much money on their armies and their bombs. They may be required to contribute 10 or 15% of that to a world development authority, and of course we too would be required to contribute in similar measure. Although, of course, in actual sums, our contribution would be much smaller, because we are a nation of very small resources. They are a nation of large resources. But if ever mankind came to this understanding that a world development pool has to be created, then the problem of disarmament perhaps would be solved, because then these hooded serpents will no longer be necessary. Then treasure would no longer have to be guarded, because it would be shared. And that is the fundamental position with regard to disarmament. Of course, meanwhile, I am not against the banning of nuclear bombs. for purposes of government compromises and exchanges, nuclear bombs may be banned, but of course, always this general context must be kept in mind, what I have laid before you. Because in people's propaganda, let not this mistake arise that there is a vital difference between conventional bombs and nuclear bombs. If that impression gains ground, the world will have lost. Furthermore, with regard to other aspects of disarmament, I will straight away come to certain conflicting topics in the world today, such as India and Pakistan, China, Formosa, or Germany. Let me take up the case of Germany, because that is the most interesting, and that is probably the most immediate issue of friction. All other issues have gone into the background compared to the issue of Germany. Germany is disunited, East and West, but Germany has again become powerful. It's the third most powerful nation in the world in respect of production of steel. And as you very well know, both in keeping in mind the worth of the German soldier and the German worker and other elements of the German culture, I would not be surprised that if Germany wanted so to achieve, she would easily have the third or the second or the first army in the world once again. Because Americans and Russians may have the long arm, but the Germans somehow possess the cleverness of acquiring the, strong fist. So the strong fist of the Germans may, at least for sudden attacks, be again as significant in the affairs of the world as the long arm of the Russians or the Americans. Anyway, that is the background of Germany. Germany is at present disunited. But what was the condition 7 years ago? Germany as well as Japan were defeated. They were occupied. Foreign armies were stationed there. At that time, mankind had the opportunity to achieve entirely new solutions, because a new situation had been created. A great power defeated and occupied, whose peoples were in a mood to listen to new departures. But what was the reaction? As far as the great powers were concerned, the reaction was, as illustrated by Mr. Morgenthau and other American statesmen, that Germany should be split up into many nations, or that Germany should be reduced to an agrarian status, all agriculture, no industries. You may have forgotten, but please try to remember, these were the serious and official solutions put forward 7 years ago, when these Western wives were angry. They had fought a war, a big war. They had won it. They were angry. And in their anger, they proposed such solutions. One of the greatest tragedies of mankind is that it has been governed and will continue to be governed by human beings who are prone to anger, feelings of revenge, bitterness, greed, arrogance, and the like. Now these were men who were inspired by the feeling to wreak a vengeance on Germany. Therefore, cut it up into various parts, reduce it to an agrarian status. I can understand that. They were blinded by prejudice. The Russians also at that time were blinded by such enormous prejudice that they were not prepared to listen to any new solutions in respect of Germany, and they also proposed solutions which meant more or less either the disintegration of Germany or its complete subjugation under Russian control. But then why talk of them? Why not talk of ourselves, the inheritors to Mahatma Gandhi? A people who did not take part in the last war, who did satyagraha, who said, if you may remember, in 1940, 41, 42, 43, what did they say? under the command of the great apostle of non-violence. एक पाई और एक आदमी देना हराम है. To that 1939-1945 war. That was the war. That war had nothing to do with us. It was a war between the Allies and the Axis powers. We had kept out of it. We had our own requirements. We had our own national needs. And when such men who had cried that it is sin to give a pie or a man to that war came into power, they literally swallowed all the past of that war and treated Germany as though they had defeated it, treated Japan as though they had defeated it. For it will surprise you to learn that the government of India, manned by the inheritors of Mahatma Gandhi, called Germany and Japan enemies from 1947 to 1952. They were our enemies just because these Mahatma Gandhi's inheritors either forgot all about it or because their faith in Mahatma Gandhi's principles is somewhat sketchy and temporary. They too have their temporary opinions. Just as the Western statesmen were blinded by temporary prejudices and anger, in similar manner, India's statesmen and Asia's statesmen were blinded by some kind of prejudice or the other and continued to treat Germany and Japan as enemies, took reparations from them. Of course, the jackals share. The Russians and the Americans took reparations from Germany and Japan going up to billions of rupees. And we took reparations going up to a few crores, 4 crores or 5 crores. So the lion's share was taken by them, the jackal's share was taken by us. And what jackal? A jackal who had shouted for all 5 years that he had nothing to do with the lion. But as soon as he becomes partner with the lion, he goes on and takes his share. Now that was the position of India. That situation was wholly bungled. Again, I may inform you of the position of India's socialism taken right at the start in 1947-48. India's socialism had suggested that Germany and Japan should not be treated as vanquished countries, at least by Asian governments. That the distinction between victor and vanquished must be obliterated. That we wish to start a new world without the burdens and infamies of the old. That Germany and Japan should be recognized as free and independent countries. That their pacific reunification should take place, and that such a free and independent Germany or Japan should receive guaranteed neutralization, and their peoples should also be prepared to accept that status. Neutralization is not demilitarization. It does not mean that you disband your armies. The armies may still be there, although they may be kept in check. They may not increase without let or hindrance. There may be limited armies, that is another matter. But neutralization is not demilitarization. Neutralization is only an attitude of mind which keeps aloof from the global conflict. So, a guaranteed neutralized Germany and Japan would have agreed to keep away from the conflict between Russia and Japan. These two great spots of power, economic and armed power in the world, would thus have become neutralized spots. This was the solution put forward. Mr. Molotov of the Russians has accepted this solution now. After 7 years of tarrying and delaying and bungling and corrupting the German situation in the same way as the Americans or the Indians did. Now it's too late. Now I do not think there is any significant party inside Germany which could take up this cry. It might have done so 7 years ago when the Germans and the Japanese were at the low rung of the ladder and where any message of sympathy would have meant something to them. Similarly, I would now take up, you may be wondering, I haven't referred to Kashmir at all and to Goa. After all, their president says, they are part of India. And I have no intention to go off into this question of Goa, apart from saying that that is a very perfect demonstration of the competence and the wisdom of the India government. How truly wise and how vastly competent this government is. If I were to remind you of another instance, this government celebrated the occasion of the ending of the civil war in Indochina by shooting some people dead on the streets of Indore and by issuing proclamations that the day had dawned when not a single soldier was fighting any other soldier in the world anywhere. Of course, they were not fighting elsewhere, but when uniformed soldiers were shooting non-uniformed Indians in the streets of Indore. Now that is the foreign policy of India in one of its features. As far as Goa is concerned, it's perfectly clear. I hadn't spoken for a whole year on this problem. Some people have wondered why I have not done so. Obviously, I hope the people of India know me well enough to understand that I have not become an ally of Mr. Salazar. But then, what is to be done? If one finds Salazar in one's own midst, and the whole question of Goa has been so utilized by political leaders in India, both belonging to the government party and the opposition parties. I make this accusation against both of them, has been so utilized as to give glory to themselves, to send volunteers from among the mass of the people to a certain death in dungeons like the Castle Rock, to sit away at a distance of a few hundred miles and issue statements. That is what these leaders have done in respect of Goa. I do not mind people being slaughtered in a battle of civil resistance. If 20 or 40 had been murdered in its place, if 50 or 500 had been slaughtered, I would not be grieved. But if men, our own people, even one or two are slaughtered without purpose, without aim, except the aim to give glory to their leaders, I must say that is not civil resistance, that is not a fight for Goa, that is nothing. That is a shame and an insult to India and the long 30 years of training of civil resistance that we acquired from our leader. But forget the case of Goa. Actually, I believe that Goa will be solved. Of course, there's not much of a problem about it, but then I suppose its solution would be more or less coterminous with the solution of the capital and the throne of Delhi. When Delhi changes, Goa will also change, so it's perfectly all right. Now, that is as far as Goa is concerned. Now, Kashmir. This problem of Kashmir, right from the start, the principles to be enunciated should have been recognition of existing frontiers and Pacific unification, if possible, and guaranteed neutralization, if necessary. These 3-point programs, A, recognition of existing frontiers. B, Pacific unification when possible. C, guaranteed neutralization should have been worked out in respect of all disputed problems, such as China Formosa, Israel Arab world, India Pakistan, or Germany or Japan. Now, of course, it's too late. We have probably got into the bad old ruts of old diplomacy. Everything comes to an end, everything good and bad. I do not know whether I have been able to place my viewpoint before you. It must end anyway. Although it is thoroughly incomplete. I know there is a lot else to say, but now I must end it here by expressing this wish that perhaps the people of India would be able to evolve a foreign policy which will not depend on governmental agencies alone. This is a grave defect of foreign policy all over the world. There is always a leader-to-leader relationship, a government-to-government relationship, but never a people-to-people relationship in international affairs. A leader-to-leader, a government-to-government. Not only in India, elsewhere. There is no thinking about international questions. When one's government decides to be friendly with another power, then the entire people, the press, the publicity agencies, and visiting dignitaries, great things, are tuned up to that requirement. We are giving very great welcomes to visiting dignitaries. I would not talk about the dignitaries from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, but the reception given to the Russians was terrific. What is that? Regarding Russia, there seems to be a telepathic connection between this gentleman and me. Really wonderful. I would ask this questioner to meet me sometime after the 3rd of January. How does it happen that you write about the Russian visit and I start talking about the Russian visit? If I believed in a past existence, I would have said that you and I had some kind of a relationship. But the Russian visit, it was terrific. Terrific. It pleased me very much. And I can tell you the reason for my pleasure. And it was a very childish reason indeed. And it was this, that the reception given to the Russian leaders in Calcutta was 6 times as large as the largest ever given to a native leader in that city. This gave me enormous pleasure, because every time I was reminded of the size of my own meetings compared to the size of these native leaders. Of course, only one of them. There aren't many. The Prime Minister of India, you see, whenever questions came up, now look here, the Prime Minister has a crowd of 50,000, you get only 5,000 or 10,000. It was not always 1/5, often it's 1/2, 1/2 or slightly less. But anyway, when I found that the native leader and the largest reception ever given to him in Calcutta was only 1/6 of the reception given to these foreign leaders, I may have been pleased. But that is enough to make the native leaders drown themselves in their bathtub. Never before in the history of the world have native leaders been given such scanty consideration at the hands of their own population in a free country. In an enslaved country, things like that may happen. But in a free country, that foreign leaders should get 6 times the reception as the largest ever given to a native leader is an unheard of event, never happened before, and I believe shall never happen again. Should never happen again. Of course it will happen again if Delhi continues to be administered or not administered in the fashion that it is. Why that reception was given is a long story. There may have been various reasons. I will merely enumerate them. Number one, the people may have been caught up in a festive mood. They have seen films of how their own man was given a reception in Russia, so they might have said, now let's give them a return something, a festive occasion. Secondly, they may have been somewhat influenced by the Indo-Pakistan conflict, in which America had ranged herself on the side of Pakistan, and it was expected that Soviet Russia may range herself on the side of India, which actually happened. And I must say that the Russians are really warm-hearted. I'll come to that a little later. Third, something about ourselves, that as a people, we are inclined to respect power, even when it is cruel. And actually, we respect our gods and our leaders in the ratio of their capacity to inflict cruelty. We worship a Kali only to the measure that she is powerful enough to inflict cruelty. Political leaders are also judged by the standard of how cruel they can be. Because if they can be really very cruel, then it's worthwhile to pay obeisance to them. And both the native leaders and the foreign leaders have given ample demonstration of their prowess over their own peoples in their own countries in the matter of arrests and imprisonments and shootings and guillotinings and tortures and this and that. Apart from one distinction, of course, that the native leaders have not yet given a demonstration of their prowess over other peoples, while the Russian leaders have given a demonstration of their prowess both over their own people and over other peoples. Now that is the third fact. But no, go further. There is a fourth and a fifth factor. And these two are factors which must be taken note of by the Indian people. The fourth factor is that in the eyes of the urban masses of India, I have not enough evidence to generalize about the rural masses, the Russians appear to be identified with the mass of the people. That fact has to be faced. Identified. To identify is not to represent. Mahatma Gandhi had identified himself with the Indian people, the mass of the Indian people. Mr. Nehru only represents them. And a representative can be anything. To identify is not to represent. And in the eyes of the urban masses of India, the Russian leaders appeared to have completed or carried out partially this process of identification with the poor and the distressed and the oppressed. Whether that feeling is right or wrong, with that I'm not concerned. We can go into that question, how they acquired it. But they have acquired it. I have not the slightest doubt in my mind that whether rightly or wrongly, the Russian system has awakened such ideas and hopes in the breast of the Asian masses that they tend to identify it with themselves. And with that, of course, I would like to tell my own friends of the Socialist Party that unless they carry out this process of identification, nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. It's complete identification. Identification in thought, in language, in sitting together, in drinking tea together. Identification even to the extent of the so-called high castes and the lower middle classes, who actually are the staple substance for every political organization in the country. Every political organization in the country, including the Socialist Party, is largely built out of the so-called higher caste, or let us say, the lower middle classes, the intellectuals, the clerks, the lawyers, the this and that, the leading elements. So unless they treat themselves as the manure out of which leaders shall grow from among working men and the low caste, unless such identification takes place, I don't think anything much can be done. And the fifth reason, of course, is that Russia appears to the Indian urban masses as an emblem of what a backward country can do to herself through industrialization. Russia 30 years ago was comparatively backward, without adequate armies or without adequate industries, and through industrialization and a serious effort, Russia has brought herself up almost, not entirely, but almost to the level of America. And that the Indian people see. The Indian people are not able to see that in America. In the first place, America has not identified itself in the eyes of the Indian people. I am again not going into the merits of the question. In the eyes of the Indian people, America is not identified with the poor. Because America has always been rich ever since we have been hearing about America. And the working man in America is as rich as the richest in India. Nor is America an emblem of a country that industrializes itself in the short space of 20 or 30 years. Because America has been industrializing herself for over 150 years. So these five factors were there. Now whatever that may mean, incidentally, whatever I'm talking about, the end of my speech is that these Russian visitors or any other visitors, they are only an illustration of leader-to-leader relationship, government-to-government relationship. That people-to-people relationship does not exist anywhere in the world. In no ranks, not communist, not capitalist, not religious, and I am sorry to have to say, not even socialist. Because socialism, in its international aspect, died in August 1914. It has to be revived. It shall be revived and must be. Because without international socialism, the world can never be one nor free. The world can never work out these policies of United Nations and collective security and disarmament and international development authority and the recognition of existing frontiers and guaranteed neutralization, which I outlined before you. Only international socialism can do so. But then socialism will have to radically revise itself. Today, socialism is a question of action within national frontiers. All men are equal, but within the nation. International socialism must inscribe on its banners the belief that all men are equal, not only within the nation, but also among the nations. And when they do so, these various policies that I outlined before you will probably have started operating. Whether there is one war or two or none is an immaterial question. The question is whether the world is able to create new forces on the lines that I indicated.